Thank you very much for coming. First of all, another thanks again to Mark Jenkins, who I thought making a film about an exhibition which you really need to be there to see is really tricky. And I thought he did it incredibly well and really patiently. So a round of applause for Mark, I think. This afternoon, I was taking some of the exhibition boards that you saw earlier on and helping our friends at the Maysow Visitor Centre put them up for a new display. And on the door was the poster advertising tonight, which is a picture of the two old codgers standing there. And some members of the public were coming in and they were looking at the poster and looking at me and looking at the poster. And this woman goes, and then comes across and says, "Excuse me." And I went, "Yeah." And she said, "Are you Nick Card?" So I said no. And she went, "Oh," and walked away. So just in case you're here tonight, that's Nick. Okay, enough of that. The other thing to say before we get into the main body of the talk is, the conversation is that it happens to be the two of us up here. But strictly speaking, if we were going to do this properly, we should also have Anne Mitchell, who's here tonight, up here with us, and also Sigurd Towery. But that would mean we'd start to look a bit like the four Yorkshiremen in the Monty Python stuff. So perhaps not. But very much what we're talking about is the consequence of the four of us and a very big team working over the last 20 years and on into the future. But let's begin by me asking a couple of questions of Nick. Nick, we've heard about you coming up to Orkney. Why did you come to Orkney in the first place?
I first came up to Orkney many, many moons ago as a student, in fact, to meet some of my friends who'd been digging at the original excavations at Links in Auckland. And a couple of years later, I partook in the excavations at Auckland myself, and from there worked with Bradford University as a research assistant, and used to spend my summers up here, winters down in Bradford. And then 30 odd years ago, I had the chance to move up here, leapt at the chance, and unfortunately when I moved up, archaeology was kind of in a lull. So for about 10 years I became a builder, specialising in traditional builds, which has become exceedingly useful when it comes to interpreting the way that some of these structures are put together, and then just being in the right place at the right time when it came to the Ness of Brodgar and many of the other projects I've been involved in. And from there, well, the rest is history, so to say, or prehistory.
So you came to Orkney, you're working on various projects, and no doubt over those years, as it was for me when I first came in 1987 to work with Colin, who's here tonight, at the back of the Stones of Stennis, driving backwards and forwards past this long ridge that defines the Ness, without a clue that there was anything on it, really. And I don't know, because you were living at the top of the hill.
Well, I think the Ness has always appeared just to be a natural feature in the landscape, and I think for the last 20 years what's been revealed has become a total revelation to us all. I remember being interviewed on American television, and the interviewer asked me, he said, "Well, you must have felt like a real fool having driven past it so often and not realising what it was." So I think I quipped back that, well, if I felt like a fool, so did every other archaeologist who had ever visited Orkney.
Well, George Marwick had a sense of things back in the 20s. And of course, farmers who'd been working that land were probably aware if there was something there, because they would have been cursing every time the plough bounced over some of the walls. And one of the things I loved about the excavation was that you could still see the line of the plough as it had been running up and down the field before the site was first discovered by archaeologists, not by others. But yeah, I don't think anybody had any expectation that there was going to be the kind of stuff that we found here.
No, I think Mr. Marwick definitely must have had a crystal ball or something, because that quote that he wrote in 1925.
So that's before the discovery of the stone, isn't it?
That was just after the discovery
just
of the
after.
stone.
Right. So the project begins. So how did things get going?
Well, it was very small scale to begin with, and it was basically in the light of the geophysics, the initial geophysics that we did. And that was conducted by somebody else in the audience tonight, somebody I'm sure is well known to many of you, John Gator of Time Team fame. And John was commissioned by us to come and start the World Heritage Geophysics Programme. And then a couple of years later, a year later, then there was discovery of the Big Notch slab. And from there, things slowly snowballed. But it's all been due down to, initially, the wonderful people who owned the land. Here we see Ola and Arnie. And I think in the next slide,
Yeah.
there we see Carol Hoy giving a hand with the original excavations in 2003.
That's with Beverley, isn't it?
In Beverley Ballinsmith, yeah.
So that's the corner of structure one. And at that point, it would be quite easy to imagine it would be like so many ploughed out Neolithic sites that you've got that kind of depth, and then you're down to the lowest courses of the wall. But I mean, what was it like to realise just how much depth there was surviving there?
Frightening.
Frightening.
I could see my retirement, as I still do, slowly slipping over the horizon. So it took several years, but it was that kind of, I think, almost light bulb eureka moment in 2004 when we first started opening a series of test pits. And it was a realisation that we were dealing with this huge depth of archaeology potentially, but that even those test pits didn't show the full scale, but it showed the potential of the site. And it was from there that things gradually got bigger and bigger until eventually the trenches that we had to backfill at the end of last year.
I mean, right from the outset, it was shocking that the full extent of it that way, but then the revelation that it just kept going down and down, and that there were buildings on top of others.
But it was the realisation of the timescale that represented as well, was touched on in the film, well over 1,200 years of activity.
Yeah. So early days, and quite a small team to begin with, run through the college.
Yeah, it was, I think initially in the first season, there was probably half a dozen of us.
Right.
Along with John Cluett, who was doing a PhD looking at soils. Then this was Trench J in its initial incarnation.
So that's a bit of the Great Wall coming through there.
Just beginning of the Great Wall.
Yeah.
At that stage, it didn't really make much sense. Still doesn't.
Oh, look, there's a county archaeologist.
He looks just as young today.
He does indeed. He does indeed. Sorry about that, Paul. And there's another one. I love the technique.
Took years to perfect that.
You've posed for about 3/4 of an hour for that picture as well. Yeah, it's interesting that the project has gone on for so long that it stretches back to a time when we were using cameras that really don't have the kind of resolution that we now take for granted. So the pictures do change in their character as you go through. But yeah, right from the start, lots of really extraordinary things coming out of the ground. Big slab of pottery in the bowl there, isn't there?
Well, I think that was one of the first major decorated pieces we discovered, and I think we took about 2 days to excavate that one sherd. So when you think about that, if we multiplied it up and applied it to every single sherd that had been discovered at the Ness, well, it'd be there forever.
Yeah. Yes, it's a good sort of 100, 120, 110,000, something like that.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really sort of come on board until about 2008, 2009. The passage of time measured out in the changing size of my children. But one of the things that struck me with the project when I first encountered it was just what a fantastic community of people were involved. Not just the excavators, many of whom are volunteers, but also the other people who would be around the site, helping out in different ways, from meeting and greeting, which became more and more important, through also to probably the most critical thing was cake. There always seemed to be loads of cake.
Well, as you say, an army marches in its stomach, and it's the same with excavation. You have to bribe them a bit.
Just wanted to have a kip after lunch, actually. And yeah, we can't really do justice to the number of people who've worked or been involved in one way or another with the project over the years. This is just a small smattering of pictures of some of the folk. But I mean, it is remarkable over the 20 years or so that there really has been a really strong community formed, hasn't there? That people have kept coming back. Yeah,
it's been one of the memorable things about the Ness is that people that, well, it's not just attracted them, a lot of them came here because they're interested in it. and some of them we've caught and not let go of, thankfully. So it's a huge team effort, as I keep on saying, but we couldn't do it when you think about thousands of volunteers, excavators, and the people who've added to the atmosphere, all the visitors to the site, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of people who have visited the site. It's what makes Ness what it is.
I'm certainly not advocating for there not to be sort of professional archaeological projects at all, but the character. See, I even had to mention the possibility of being professional. It's cut out. But one of the things that I think has been really important, has made it a pleasure, is just the range of people, the range of backgrounds that come to the place, the conversations that come from that. And often they're about the Ness, they're about interpreting the material, but they're also always about other things as well, aren't they? And it's just been absolutely lovely.
I think you could get an amazing education just by standing at the edge of the trench and listening to some of the diggers talking about a whole range of things.
Yep, absolutely. So last summer, saw the end of the excavations, and over the autumn then the site has been filled in. This is the last of the team shots in 2024. So the site's been put to bed, and we might talk about the character of that towards the latter part of the conversation, but we're into the next stages now, the post-excavation process.
I think that to many people the sexy side of archaeology is the excavation, but what the revelations that come out of the post-excavation are just as exciting, piecing together that 100,000, 200,000 jigsaw and making sense of it all, or hopefully making sense of it all. So the potential of the Ness is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for reasons of conservation, it made sense to fill it in. And it was a very emotional moment when it was finally when we finally closed the dig. But I was talking to people about it and just thinking, well, we've spent 20 years building up all the materials to do the most amazing collage. And now we enter the exciting phase of trying to do that. Just to give a sense of, we're not going to talk about lots of different kinds of evidence because we'd be here all night. And although I'm sure you're not that interested in being here till midnight. But just to give you a flavour of the range of the kind of artefacts. I mean, lots of different pottery, which is being looked at by Roy Towers and Jan Blatchford and others. Bone, whether it be a predominantly cattle bone, but also we've got some whale bone and some bone tools being looked at by Ingrid Mainland and others. And then lots of stone tools of many different kinds. I could just sit and look at that for hours, but we won't. So we just give you a little flavour of those. But just again, to get that sense of time, I mean, we could show you this in several ways. We could show you our hair colour in 2003, and then you could compare it to now. But this is structure 12, or what would become structure 12 in 2010. Here it is again 2 years later. Starting to take a familiar shape by 2013. Is this scaring you, Jim? By 2019, and then 2023. When I was putting these pictures together in the PowerPoint, I was just looking at them and just thinking, all by hand, all with small trowels, small hand shovels, and brushes and scalpels. And occasionally when we had visitors, you'd say, they said, when did you get the machines in? And we'd say, no, we've just done this by hand. And they'd just go, bloody mad. But it is phenomenal.
But I think to see the time depth, and yes, it has been a lot of hard work, but it's been enjoyable, I think, on the whole, although maybe Jim might disagree. But I think that what it's been uncovered, the sequence of managed to unpick, in the case of Structure 12, again, mainly the work of Jim, who's in the audience tonight. But again, just the beauteous nature of Structure 12, but then to unpick the whole history of it, to see the way it's changed. It's not just a unitary build. It's been modified, changed, additions made to it. You see phases of collapse and decay, and then coming back. And it's like the bunch of cowboy builders moved in and did a bit of rebuild here, a bit of rebuild there. But yes, to see the sequence, the biography of each of the structures, to unpick it has been amazing.
I think one of the things that I think is worth noting is that it's 20 years of excavation. It's a long period of time, and it's partly because of the way we've run seasons and the mix of people that we've had involved. But what that really has allowed us to do, and if you'd agree, is it's allowed us the time to actually really look at the site, look at the structures, look at the deposits that they're associated with, and really take them apart.
Well, I think that things have moved on. I can remember excavating 30, 40 years ago, and technology wasn't half of what we have today. And we would have probably excavated a structure like 12 in maybe a couple of seasons. But now we are able to unpick it down to the finest detail, applying lots of science, and extract so much more information about these amazing buildings and how they all kind of fit together.
I think it's a reminder that sometimes it pays to take time to look closely at the material and to get that kind of richness. I think, towards the end of the last season, when I was finding myself sort of wandering around and sort of putting my hands on walls and things, like lots of people were, I was still seeing new things. Still seeing new things.
Yeah. And I think if we reopened it again, you'd see even more things. And no doubt even in the post-excavation when we start piecing all that together.
Yeah.
But I think one of the main reasons for it taking 20 years or so is because of the complexity of the archaeology. There's not many sites that I've ever worked on that has that complexity.
No, I remember the first time I was standing in 10, I think, and you're blown away by the walls and the scale of them, but just realising that it was 4 dimensions, that you had this standing architecture and then buildings underneath as well. I've just never seen anything like that. Okay, let's shift the focus a little bit. And one of the other things that I think has been a very important hallmark of the project has been the fact that it's being done in public, that it's being very public-facing in lots of different ways. Was that a conscious decision on your part, or?
I think it was. I think we couldn't have done anything else. Again, we had 2 very understanding kind of landowners who allowed us to open up and share what we were doing. But it kind of gradually grew and grew. But being where the Ness is, we couldn't do anything else on the main kind of tourist route through Orkney, between Ring of Brodgar, Stones of Ness, Scarlet Bray. And immediately, I think, it was evident from the first couple of seasons, the first few tours that we did, that people wanted to come and see what was happening. They're inquisitive, and they love seeing archaeology in progress.
Yeah, I mean, it's a performance in the end, isn't it? But I mean, it could have been done differently. I can say this because it was already, that aspect of it was running before I came. But one of the things that, again, I thought was really impressive was you can do a piece of field work and make it open to the public and satisfy people you've done that well. But you don't have to go the extra mile that I think the Ness project has done in terms of the way it's involved and engaged people. And it's the range of different things, as you say, that have developed over time.
But again, it was that realisation of the kind of symbiotic relationship we're having with the public, that they wanted to come and see what we're doing, we wanted to share. And at the same time, there's also that opportunity to sell the Ness. Not that we ever charged people, but it was through the support of the public that we were able to do what we could do over the last 20 years.
Certainly, there were plenty of archaeologists visiting during the seasons who would just sort of whisper in my ear, "So why aren't you charging people to come?" And I've always thought that was a really important principle, that it's open access and that it's free, and that there will be tour guides and all sorts of other things on, and that people aren't obliged to pay. Of course, there are plenty of buckets around as well, but and that's been absolutely critical to the progress of the project, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think without the public support, and the public support is something that again was probably built up over the years as more people became aware of what we're doing and that we were open to people coming, having a look around, joining a guided tour, and for some of them coming back and partaking in the excavation. then yeah, it's what we wanted to do. Because archaeology is never there for just the ivory towers. It's there for everybody to enjoy. Well, that's what I've always thought. And
No, absolutely, absolutely. So this is one of the first, or one of the early tours, isn't it? Is that Sandra?
Yeah.
That one?
Mhm.
Yeah. And then, but obviously things have grown a little bit. There's you. I think that laminated thing's still around, actually, that picture. So that's an early TV visit, is it?
I think that was for a bunch of Irish archaeologists who suddenly appeared on site one day.
And then there's you again, I think, doing an early tour, relatively early tour. Don't think you've really captivated the guy on the left.
There's always one.
But when it comes to captivating, then we get, after a few years, a really professional setup with tour guides. Here's Roy with the platform that we had until, I guess, just after COVID?
Just
before COVID, yeah. On one of those lovely sunny days. And then again, developing over time the meet and greet team, which have been absolutely critical to just the running of the site on the day-to-day basis, from the making sure that people come in and park properly to loads of other things. Really couldn't have done it without that.
I think it's like many aspects of the Ness. It's the realisation that no small group of people can do it all. So you've got to kind of share, you've got to delegate, and it's how bringing all those people on board.
Yeah.
And so many of the meet and greeters who had probably a kind of not maybe an interest in the archaeology, but they were just perfect for the job, and interacting with the people and getting, knowledgeable about the site, because they were the kind of initial face of the Ness as people came.
Yeah. We also had a number of different artists working with us over the years. Here's the late and much missed Rick Hammond. About a month or two ago, I was down at a memorial service for Lord Renfrew, Colin Renfrew, who worked up in Orkney back in the day. And one of the things that Rick made while he was working with us on site was a T-shirt which had a picture of Colin Renfrew on the front, and on the back it said, "What would Colin Renfrew do?" And at the memorial service, one of Colin Renfrew's grandchildren was wearing the T-shirt, which I thought you would probably appreciate. But we don't have much in the way of Rick's artwork digitally, but there's one or two examples. And then we've also had a number of different artists, Elizabeth, Jeannie Rose, and Karen Wallace. They are Jeannie Rose. I think that's a great picture, not bad. One of Karen's oils from developed during the excavations, and then a painted drawing by Philip Hughes. So a range of different artists working with us. And again, one of the things that was really nice about that was just the conversation opened up, didn't it? Lots of different aspects of the material that people working with us as visual artists, with the pigments, with the stone, they were really focusing on qualities that were fundamental to the archaeology.
I think more and more the recording of the Ness, that aspect of the Ness, where you get the artists coming along, and it's a totally different part of the site archive, the interpretation of it in many ways, but also just for people to look at, people to enjoy. And I think we've had something in the region of 25 different artists and residents over the years. And it's ranged not just through the media of paint or pastels or oils, but we've had dance groups, music groups, a whole range of different people.
Yeah, I just think it's just added a really important dimension to the conversations that we have in the trenches, by the side of the trenches. It just feeds back into the interpretation of the material really effectively. And then in addition to all the tours on site, we've also had open days, which have been a mammoth undertaking, a huge piece of organisation, largely down to Anne Mitchell, including obviously things on site, but also down in the Stennis Hall. There's somebody holding a bit of Morag's pelvis. Oh, that's one of my books.
It's probably worth mentioning at this point that the open days aren't finished with. We're going to be having another one at the end of July. So
Yep.
keep an eye out.
There are posters, I think, on there and outside as well. So we can be updating on progress with the work. So, but there were loads of things going on at the open days, and there were crazy amounts of people. I mean, I can't remember what the biggest one was. Do you remember?
Last year was it 1,500?
1,500 people, and yet it worked. But then you and I weren't having to give the tours, particularly. There's Ben doing flint napping, and but yeah, some of the tours. This one, I think, is Sigurd in the middle of that one somewhere. Just vast, huge numbers of people. I mean, it helped with the weather, obviously, but. Then obviously there are other offshoots. It's not the best resolution, I'm afraid, for the picture, but Ola and Arnie obviously instrumental to the setting up of the project with the very generous allowance that we could come and basically work on their land, and they were happy with that. And then that developed into a really nice collaboration, particularly Antonio Thomas working with Ola and with Sue Cross in the design of the Ness of Brodgar jewellery range, available nearby. Another collaboration with Highland Park, Ness of Brodgar Legacy. I just thought that looked so cool.
It was and very, very tasty.
Extremely tasty, yes. And somehow empty as well now.
Strange.
We've had a variety of different visitors to the site. That was such a day.
Well, I think they turned up, it was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I think by 9 o'clock in the morning they'd partaken in a dram or two
It was
already.
steaming. They were singing. It was great. Absolutely great. Did you get to keep the axe?
Unfortunately, no.
No, it was very good.
It didn't fit with my whip.
And then the ultimate accolade. Forget this current archaeology book of the year. In the shopping week parade.
Yeah. The absolute pinnacle.
Yeah, I would be very, very proud. Very good indeed. That. Okay, so let's shift the focus a little bit away from the public side of things and how it got set up. And over the years, the project has sort of grown in its scale, and as we've got into more of the material, so the questions we've been asking have started to get ever more detailed, hopefully ever more subtle as well. But let's just start by thinking about, why is the Ness where it is? Why is it there?
To me, it's a kind of easy question because there's nowhere else like the Ness. It's a totally unique location. I think I've said it so many times about this thin body of land surrounded by water in the middle of a huge natural amphitheatre that it must have, even today I think it attracts people. But 5,000 years ago I think people realised that there was nowhere else quite like it.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that quite often when archaeologists talk about monuments, they limit their discussion to things that are being built by people without recognising that the form of land or the relationship of land and water just physically can itself work in the way that many monuments do. I think one of the things, if we're starting to develop, big problem we have is just finding the right vocabulary for talking about a site that doesn't really have any parallels, does it? But if this is a place that's a very complex settlement, but also a big gathering site, and that combination is going to be absolutely crucial to the way we think about it, then it's very difficult to find any human society where you don't have to draw a line around where special things happen, or where you're on neutral territory, or on sacred space, or in an arena. And I think you're right that relationship between the water and the land is probably crucial to that.
But I think, we find difficulties in kind of finding that vocabulary to describe it. But it's not surprising because the Ness is in use for over 1,000 years. And no doubt what the people understood by it over that 1,000 years changed. And so in some ways our vocabulary, our descriptions of the site change as well.
Yeah, well, we know there are people moving through that strip, and also probably living on it as well in the Mesolithic. So where the real roots of the Ness as a special place really begin, we don't know really, do we? But certainly by the time you get to the early part of the Neolithic, just to situate you in case you're not sure where it is, this is showing the geophysics of the entirety of, well, this part of the World Heritage Area with the Ness there. And it is really interesting. There's a lot of activity, but there's that real concentration on the isthmus. But again, I think one of the things that has struck me about the significance of the site is just how deep its roots are.
Well, I think the realisation that the northern boundary wall, which initially we thought that must relate to that kind of major phase of period architecture, the kind of heyday of the Ness, as I always see it. But now we know that that wall was in existence almost from the word go, at least in the Neolithic period. So we're pushing the limits of what we know and how we understand that landscape right the way back to the start of the Neolithic and maybe even into the Mesolithic.
Yeah, I think most people would be happy to accept that by the late Neolithic, it's very evidently a special place, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But that could have been built on more sort of normal foundations. But in the early Neolithic, the buildings that we've got are similar to ones from elsewhere in the region, but they're bigger. And then there's that wall, the Great Wall, which is, well, it is maximum, it's about 6 metres wide.
It starts off 4 metres.
4, and then is expanded.
6 metres wide.
And of course, the really difficult question, how tall was it?
Good question. I don't think we'll ever particularly know, but we can guesstimate.
Yeah, somewhere 2 to 3 metres maybe. I mean, but it's got steps running into the inside of it. So we obviously lost any sense of whether there was a superstructure, but it's a massive undertaking. And again, you got that sense of people making grand statements with stone and architecture, and involving huge amounts of labour, way over what you'd find elsewhere. And it took a while for the penny to drop, for me, if I'm honest, was what we've got here are signs of large-scale collective labour. Could be as much as 500 years earlier than the big monuments. So Stones of Stennis, the Ring of Brodgar, they're not there when this is already established as a really important place. And that does make it completely different from everything else we've ever seen.
Yeah. And I think, again, when you look at the volume of the stone, the logistics that's gone into that construction, like the rest of the Ness too, you're looking at tens of thousands of tons of stone that had to be brought to site. Some of it may be coming from quite close by, like the shores of the locks, but it's still tens of thousands of tons.
It's ridiculous. I mean, one of the things that, once you've been there for a while and you start to get your eye on, is that the Great Wall has lots of these sort of weathered and slightly water-worn and wind-worn boulders, big hams, Martha calls them. And they may well have come from the lock edge or lock edges. But then you find them in other buildings, and you get that sense that rocks that are being pulled or dragged or hoyed in one way or another into place in the big wall have then been quarried out. That's the reason why the wall is low. And they've bounced across different buildings over time. So there are probably blocks in some of the walls that have been in 3 or 4 buildings over time or more. So there's a strong sense of buildings developing over time, both the sort of form of them, but also the scale and elaboration of them.
I think when we started, when Structure 1 was first uncovered, you thought it's not going to get any better, the quality of the build. And then, yes, we know that that quality was there predating Structure 1, so like Structure 28 underneath Structure 12. But it just gets bigger and grander and more refined.
Yeah.
And then you end up with something like 10, which obviously couldn't get any better than that. But
yeah, so we end up with the late Neolithic buildings, or at least some of the late Neolithic buildings that dominate. In this case, there's Trench P in the middle. After 20 years, it just still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I mean, it's just remarkable what's there. The scale of the buildings, which we'll talk about in a minute. But also, yeah, just that sense of the amount of labour that's involved and the amount of consumption of stuff that's gone into it. I mean, certainly we have plenty of animal bone that represents people eating on a relatively small scale, but then also we have got big feasts as well. But it's not just large acts of feasting or eating together with large numbers of people. It's all the stone that's caught up in it, well, who knows how many thousands of tons. The timber that would have been required and the labour. The more I think about it, the more scary that sounds.
Well, it is. It's just it's mass consumption at every level with respect to everything you find at the Ness.
Yeah, I think the appetites just get bigger and bigger. That's not a reference to Andy at all with his Sasquatch T-shirt on. But the image there of the bull created by Jan is true to scale for some of the beasts that we have there, which are absolutely massive. I remember Ingrid holding up a modern shin bone and one of the intact shin bones from the Ness, and that was so much bigger. That was the first time the penny dropped for me.
It was like a dinosaur.
Yeah, and then obviously we have other evidence for consumption on a grand scale with the big midden mound. Can you remember the dimensions of it?
It's, well, 70 to 80 metres thereabout, give or take 10 metres, but to a height of 4 to 5 metres surviving today. But when you think that most of that is peat ash, and then you think about, I can remember cutting peat when I lived on Hoy, and the amount of labour-intensive activity that was required. But that must represent, tens of thousands of firing events. And again, to actually cut it, bring it to sites, and then use it, that is a massive, massive undertaking.
It's quite staggering, really, the amount of turf that's been cut and then dried and brought in, and probably some way. And then that mound itself, it may be several metres thick now, but it would have been twice as thick, twice as deep, rather. Oh, it's phenomenal. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture. Do you remember when you suddenly thought, oh, hang on a minute, this is really special? When did that penny drop for you?
I think as soon as that corner of structure 21 was revealed by Beverly and her team, and there we can see it there, but little could we imagine that 20 years later you'd see that wall being exposed to over 1 metre in height.
Yeah.
But just the quality of the masonry was evident right from the word go, I think. Yes, there's been some of the smaller structures which are generally very late in sequence, which don't really hold that kind of grandeur in their makeup. But I think, from the beginning and every year, I remember when we opened up the area just over the complete, or what we thought was going to be the complete structure structure 1. And then in one corner of that trench, there was yet more piers showing up that no doubt related to another structure that turned into structure 8. And then your mind starts kind of playing games. And when we opened up what turned out to be structure 12, initially it was considered, could this be the other end of structure 8? Because nothing would have kind of surprised us at that stage about the scale of what the Ness might represent.
Yeah, I think anybody living in Neolithic Orkney on other settlements would have recognised the layout and the sort of arrangement of space in these buildings, because the work of people like Colin Richards and others have shown that there is a very strong shared pattern to the kind of footprint, but not on this scale.
No, I think all the separate elements you see, so like even the piers, which are so characteristic, yes, they're used in a much more kind of regular sense in the structures of the Ness and at, say, structure 2 at Barnhouse. But you find piers, just single piers, in some of the earlier buildings at Scannon Bray, the same with the corner buttresses. It's all there, but what they seem to be doing is joining it, making it much, much bigger, grander, more ornate. And
doing it again and again over time. So here we've got structure 8, and underneath it in the blue is structure 18, and in the yellow structure 17, and then the green at the top, structure 10. A palimpsest, a proper build-up and reworking of an area over and over again. It must have just looked like a building site for much of its history, mustn't it?
Well, I think if you wanted to take that to the extreme with this image, you've also got structure 11, structure 7, structure 19, structure 34, all just kind of sneaking into that picture.
I ran out of colours.
But yeah.
So as you go through time, I mean, throughout we're dealing with grand buildings, but the buildings get bigger, they get more dramatic, and the masonry is. Well, you've spent time working with dry stone walling. It is impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, and also some of the masons we've had visit the site have said they would have found it difficult to actually accomplish what our Neolithic ancestors did 5,000 years ago. But it's when you get into structure 10, and as we'll see with one of the other structures, it's a quality not just of the interior, but also the exterior.
Yeah, I mean, they're not just making a statement because they're big. Yeah. They're making a statement because there's huge amounts of skill gone into selecting the stone, but also coursing and dressing and all sorts of other things. So these are definitely buildings that are making grand statements, aren't they? We just need to work out what kind of statements they might be. Yeah, I mean, you see it right the way through from the kind of selection of raw materials. One of the things that, again, I think is really interesting is the range of rocks that we have in individual buildings and between buildings as well.
I think, again, it just emphasises that kind of idea that the Ness was a place of consumption where they're utilising rock from many, many different areas of the landscape, many different locations, material coming from down the Scapa Flow, the other side of the Loch of Harry, really all over.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, you go somewhere, you go to Skara Brae, and the buildings are extraordinary and they're really well built. But they're mostly built with local raw materials, things that were not located too far away. And the signs were there already, because I mean, the late and very missed John Flett Brown pointed out with the Ring of Brodgar that the rocks that make up, the slabs that make up the circle there have come from different places. And that's a quality that the Ness shares, because we've got lots of different sources, and some of them are probably within a couple of kilometres, but there are others that must be quite a bit further away.
Well, there's those new quarries we were just speaking about this morning, about on the shore of the Loch of Harry, which are only being revealed now that the water level's dropped. I remember noticing them 5 or 6 years ago, but again, becoming evident. But then it's also a kind of bank along the shore, which could be yet more quarry faces.
I think it's highly likely you've got quarrying, and in fact, some of the results of the surveys that Caroline Wickham-Jones was involved in showed that there were structures of some sort, which are most likely quarries running along on the Stennis Loch side, but also in Harry Loch. So there's material coming from either side of the isthmus. There's probably material coming from the Stony Hill sort of ridge that runs across. And then we've got stuff that's probably coming from the edge of Scapa Flow and maybe from the north of Kirkwall as well. So a huge catchment bringing stuff in, which again tells us it's different. And then when they get the stone there, they're just doing this beautiful coursing. This is from structure 1, isn't it? And then also, again, it's just the amount of attention that's paid. This is one of the piers in structure 12 with these very distinctive stones on the end of the pier, which have been pecked. They're kind of more like a freestone, dimension stone, where you can work it in different directions, and they've been hammered and peck dressed to create a really lovely effect.
It's just a refinement that they're doing the rounding off corners, making flick faces flatter where necessary. It's just for the sake of aesthetics rather than necessity.
I think, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I don't think it's only really in the process of having done the excavation that you realise that you can't separate aesthetics from engineering. It's absolute, they're entangled all the way through. I remember when the first of these red triangles turned up. It was in the film, so you've already had a preview. And Antonio was picking up, recording not just the 2 bas-relief triangles, but there are other triangles across that peck dress surface. And then you find more and more of them. I mean, there's not hundreds because they'd probably been taken away, but you just think, what did the walls look like? Do you have, is it like the cathedral? Do you have bands of red and yellow and triangles set up? No, it could be. But I mean, a huge amount of time and skill to create that. And then, of course, again, something that Antonio's been looking at, the rock art.
Such an amazing array that we've got. Just encompasses everything. I mean, yeah, I can still remember the first piece being uncovered inside back in 2005, and we all got very excited by that. And then once we'd all got our eye in, there was one afternoon where I think we started off the afternoon with 2, maybe 3 examples of rock art. By the end of the afternoon, we discovered 8, which was just wow. But by the end of the excavations last year, must be getting on for 1,500, 2,000 examples of Neolithic art.
Yeah, and there's still more to look at as well. Yeah, I mean, this slab, which was underneath the buttress of the second phase of structure 10, wasn't it? Really elaborately carved. And no small undertaking to lift into position or indeed to get out. When we were putting this into the show last summer in Tankermas House, Katie and Norna and I just decided that we were not going to risk our backs. So Katie phoned a friend who, for a 6-pack, came in and just lifted it and put it in. Apparently he does it competitively. I did feel quite sort of diminished by that. But yes, so you get the impression that the carving of these rocks, some of them at least, it does seem to have been important that they were part of the foundations of the buildings. But again, one of the things that's been really fascinating about Antonia's work is how she's shown that, you know, some of this carving, incised, inscribed work across the stones would have been visible to people when they were inside a building or when they were going around the outside, but so much of it was not. And just one of the things that, you know, her work has made me think about is the idea that rock art, with all the connotations that term throws up, was actually part of the building process.
Well, I think when one of the walls are actually dismantled in smaller ephemeral structural level, to actually see it in action, where you could actually see that they'd been carving designs as the wall was being built.
Yeah.
It's a real eye-opener.
So yeah, there are so many different reasons why masons would mark the materials, ranging from the very, very practical and personal to even to the spiritual. So I think we can leave it to our imaginations, but it does seem to have been integral to the building, doesn't it? And then there's the roofs. Again, at what point did the roof drop and you realise, sorry, that was really rubbish?
Well, I think it was in structure 8 where we came upon this horizon of flat slabs just above the floor levels. And people were kind of questioning, was it just paving or whatever? But it was one of the things that, being a traditional builder, had taught me. One of the things we specialised in was traditional Caithness flagged roofs. So as soon as I saw a bit of this exposed, I just went, that's a collapsed roof. And the analysis that we've done by collecting and carefully recording, in the case of Structure 8, hundreds of these stone slabs, and then Neil Ackerman, student who pulled all the information together, I think proved beyond doubt that this was a collapsed flagstone roof. And a technique which hasn't changed in Orkney in 5,000 years.
No, the lovely information on the way the sizes are graded as you go from the crown to the...
Something we were still doing today.
Again, one of the things that I was struck by was you don't find... I mean, Structure 8 had one ending with this collapsed roof so we could see it all. But in many of the buildings, you only find a few of these stones.
I think it was being recycled again and again. And again, even today, builders will recycle flagstones from old buildings for new builds. Mm-hmm. So it's...
particularly stone that has to be just right if you're going to be able to split it.
Yeah.
That's going to be highly priced. So yeah, again, some of the roofs have probably gone from one building to another and to another. Same probably goes for timbers as well, actually.
I think undoubtedly, I think that when you think about the amount of timber that must be necessary to hold some of these flagstone roofs up, and yes, there was timber being found, probably primarily in the shores, but it would have still been a very valuable resource that would have been collected and curated, and no doubt reused, recycled.
Yeah, I think with, the work of people like Scott, Timpany and others have shown that there's certainly more woodland around during the course of the Neolithic, although it does drop as you get into the Bronze Age. But so that may well have been a source, but the shoreline and driftwood must have been absolutely essential. And in many ways, driftwood's as difficult to work as stone. But I mean, there may well have been the odd stone roof building on other settlements, but most of them have organic roofs. So it must have been a real surprise or a shock coming over the ridge to see just this dense profusion of buildings with big stone roofs on them. And again, you can never get bored. Well, I can never get bored of just looking at the scale of these walls. I mean, you know, the level of skill that's gone into selecting stone and placing them, and the performance of building it, the number of people that would have been involved in dragging all of that material to the isthmus.
And I think, again, the idea that this was just done with people power, I think is going to be, looked at. Well, we are looking at it again. We have an MRS student who's starting to look for evidence for traction in some of the cattle board. And I'm sure that they would have utilised cattle to drag, move, sledge material to the site.
And yeah, I mean, it'll be really interesting. Ingrid Maindon, as we were talking about the other day, about whether or not there'll be changes in the foot bones that are respect the heavy weights that animals are being asked to drag. Would that we had enough feet bones? God, you can tell specialists, can't you? The bones of people's feet to see whether or not they also show the same lines. I do imagine that there must have been times when it was just huge numbers of people, either willingly or under a certain amount of obligation or coercion, having to.
Well, I think that's one of the big questions about the Ness in Neolithic society.
Yeah.
Is how is it made up?
Yeah. I think it was really interesting with having so many members of the public coming, and they would see all of these buildings, 5,000 years or so old, and they would assume that they were built to last.
I think we see it quite often in the Neolithic, where it's almost you build it for display, but then very quickly it starts to deteriorate. It's that initial impact these buildings would have had.
And what kind of timescales do you think that's operating over?
Well, I think, again, it varies from structure to structure. Some of these buildings, when you look at the foundations, and the way I say, for instance, structure 12 has, a collapse subsided. Yes, they were propping up the roof and doing other things, rebuilding bits of walls. But maybe the initial build, in some cases, was less than a generation. But I think in other buildings, as we'll see with structure 27, are we actually seeing structures that were just built for a specific event? And that was it, one-off.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's because this stuff's 5,000 years old, it's really tempting to think that they're built to last. But they do seem to be built for the moment, to make a grand statement. And then after that statement's made, and certainly by the time we get, let's say, to a generation passing, the focus shifts.
Yeah.
I think something you said earlier on about cowboys, that the initial build is often so beautiful, isn't it? And then when the weight of a roof starts to push the walls down and you start to see slumping and the walls falling over, the rebuilds tend to be a little less accomplished, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I think that's exemplified in structure 12.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that, again, it's just reminding us that it's the act of building it and that big statement that gets made when they're first put up. That's what really matters. And then, gradually over time, you either repair a building, try and hold it up, shore it up against the weight of... I mean, some of the roofs could be, 15, 20 tons? Is that? Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Or you just start again. And I think, like you said, it's that 1,200 plus years of reiteratively working this place over. So you might start with, as you were saying, the natural landform makes this a special place. But once you've got history going there, it's all of that you're building on as well, isn't it? So, how does it come to an end?
It doesn't happen overnight. How long ago? Yeah.
Not that long.
Yeah. If you want to kind of say, why does the Ness come to an end? You could say, okay, right, Neolithic comes to an end, you get the start of the Bronze Age. But that is such a simplistic equation. So I think there's lots of things contributing to the end of the Ness. But if society is changing, things are moving on. And whatever the Ness had represented finally comes to an end. But that kind of Neolithic, Bronze Age transition, I think, is almost encapsulated in the Ness in a very simple way. When you look at the animal bone spread around structure 10, represented 400 to 600 cattle being killed, as far as you can tell, at the same time. But then just above those kind of the barbed and tanned arrowhead and a single sherd of what Alison Sheridan's now calling northern beaker pottery, early Bronze Age, just above that. So there is that kind of change beginning to happen. But that's only just one element of it. I think there's so many other things happening, not overnight, maybe not over a generation. It's all kind of moving on.
But it is quite staggering that we've got late Neolithic grooveware. Correct me if I'm wrong, Roy and Jan, but sort of 110, 120,000 sherds. How many sherds of beaker have we got? One.
Well, maybe two.
I forget how many flint, typical late Neolithic arrowheads we have, quite a lot. How many Bob and Tang, sort of early Bronze Age arrowheads have we got? One. So there's a shift, a scale difference. So there does seem to be quite an abrupt sort of end to things. Structure 10 is not the end of it, though, is it? Because the building stone, particularly the inner face, which probably would have been very, very grand indeed, is robbed out, isn't it? So it goes somewhere else.
It's one of the big mysteries about the Ness. You have all this wonderful building stone being robbed, but where the hell's it going to?
Under the bungalow. It's under the bungalow. So, yeah, well, we haven't got the latest building on the site, but we've dug enough, I think, to show that there is quite a significant transformation at the end of the Neolithic-ish. The thing falls apart. And you do wonder whether or not all the evidence that we've been amassing for massive appetites for stone, for timber, for labour, for food, making these grand statements, that it's just not sustainable. I do think it's interesting that when prehistory is often visited to try and find models for sustainability that we can apply to the present, the Ness isn't really a good example of that, is it?
But I think that idea of sustainability, it's not just at the end of it. I think that there's other kind of hiatuses within the site history, where equally that sustainability just couldn't be sustained.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no reason to assume that the fortunes of particular family lines or lineages or whatever would be maintained across that time. In fact, it would be bizarre indeed. So there may well be all sorts of punctuations in the sequence. Okay, let's just finish with one more wafer-thin trench, Trench T, and with a building that has really been occupying our imaginations a lot over the last few years. Structure 27.
Where to begin?
Where to begin? Yeah, well, the first is to thank Kieran Dodds for this aerial shot, which is absolutely fantastic. You've got the big midden mound, which runs down and over, or certainly slumps over structure 27. And you can see that off to the left of the trench. And then when you start to get into slightly more detail, just this remarkable plan.
I don't think there's any aspect of 27 that just doesn't take your breath away. Inside, outside, the end of it, the roofing, just everything about it. And yet, the evidence we have from the actual use of the structure might suggest that it is fairly short-lived. And could it be that this was just a structure that wasn't thrown up, put up carefully for that one special event?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, given other aspects of the build, because most of the big buildings, well, many of the buildings, if not all of them, across Trench P and Trench J, every building, however grand it is made up of raw material from lots of different places. The thing that's really striking about the outer wall, the bulk of the wall that defines this one, it's all from the same quarry. It's all from the same bed. So, yeah, just used to imagine you could hear the lorry backing up to deliver it all.
Yeah.
But again, it just, all of that coming in one go, and that's not local stone. That must come from at least as far away as Stony Hill, and who knows beyond that. But just really beautifully put together, really elaborate walling.
It really was just breathtaking, and it kind of challenged anybody who saw that in the flesh not to go away with either a smile or a sense of awe and wonder.
Yeah. And paving with drains beneath all around the outside.
And again, it's the use of paving to act as, be multifunctional, where it's not just creating this paved walkway, but around three sides of it also being utilised as the foundation, so that outer wall face.
One of the things, certainly this last year, in 2024, just spending a lot of time trying to get fairly up close and personal with the coursing, it is really remarkable how regular the coursing is. But also when you start to look in detail, you can see all these little notches or little scallop shapes on the bottom edges of all of the slabs that the members in the coursing of structure 27. And those are little quarry marks. That's where somebody has put the equivalent of a bolster in and split the rock off the outcrop. And they're all put in the wall the right way up.
Yeah.
I just think it's incredible.
But it's a structure like 27, which kind of really, I think, brings into sharp focus the idea of specialities within the Neolithic. Because whoever put this up carefully, you are looking at, maybe specialist engineers, architects, or whether it's a kind of all-encompassing profession, like in the medieval period, where the cathedrals had a master mason, but he also functioned as an architect, site manager, everything. He was kind of the master planner. And maybe you're seeing something similar here. But it is taking somebody special to pull that together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly other places in Orkney, some tombs, where you see remarkable architecture, and we'll touch on those in a moment. But so it's not entirely unique to the Ness, but the Ness just goes for it in spades, that you just have these extraordinary expressions of skill. And so, I mean, one of the big challenges for us for the next few years is to be arguing about how we place masonry. The men and women who have the skills with working stone, what position did they occupy in society? How were they caught up in the broader social and political world? I don't know yet. We'll have to work that out. But again, it's trying to find the right language, isn't it? It is just a very beautiful plan with these massive orthostats marking the interior, big hearth in the middle. A simple elevation created by Sigurd, wasn't it? Was it Sigurd? Yeah. Which shows that these huge orthostats are effectively kind of skirting boards, aren't they? Yeah. So you have a stone panelled room with the upright panels held in place by orthostats that are, 4.5 metres long?
Some of them over 4.5 metres, but it's also the fact that when you look at the floor level within that structure, only about 6 inches would have been visible.
Yeah.
There's another 2.5 feet being buried in the ground.
Skirting boards.
Yeah.
We'll have to come up with a better term for that as well. And again, it's kind of interesting that although there's no way quite like the Ness or the structure 27 in this case, but there are little links, aren't there, or sort of parallels.
I think that this was one that really caught my imagination when you look at, well, unfortunately not much of the how Chamber 2 survived underneath all the later activity, but the stonework that you can see in the passageway of this Chamber 2 is, to all intents and purposes, I think, comparable to what we see in structure 27.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then, of course, this little known site just round the corner at Maze Howe. with a photograph from Jim Richardson. Again, there are lots of things about the layout which Structure 27 kind of evokes, isn't there?
Yeah, including the use of orthostats. Apart from Maze Howe, Structure 27 is the only building in Neolithic Orkney that utilises uprights to form corner buttresses.
Corner buttresses, which are, very, very distinctive. And then some of the big slabs, but particularly the skirting board slabs. Yeah. Again, drawing on the work that Martha's been doing, they look remarkably similar to the big slabs that form elements of Maze Howe, with the suggestion maybe that they might even come from the same bed and even from the same quarry. So it's just finding all those connections that stretch out. So I guess with Structure 27, I mean, let's just go back to find one picture of it. Yeah. What was it for? How long was it used for?
I was asked exactly the same questions at a conference a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, down in Edinburgh. And as I said then, post-excavation is at an early stage. It must be in 6 months' time.
Yeah, we've been having friendly discussions about the possible date of the site. A bit. I mean, we could place it across a 400 or 500 year sequence. I'm not quite sure exactly if it's Neolithic, but where it fits, don't know.
But fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
We should be getting some dates back by the end of the summer.
And that would be really good to tie down both when it's founded, when it's constructed, and also when it's taken apart, because it's another building that's demolished to see all the stone being reused. But I wonder whether radiocarbon will be enough to tell the difference. Because you mentioned it earlier on, it doesn't look like it actually was in use for very long, does it?
I think every aspect of Structure 27, all the floor deposits, when you look at some of the other buildings where they're continually patching the floors, Structure 27
doesn't have it, does it?
A clean yellow clay floor. And the same with the hearth in the centre. The actual deposits within the hearth were very, very shallow.
Yeah.
But again, we'll wait and see. Maybe it's just kept very, very clean.
Building really elaborate structures for a short-term event. Just reminds me a bit of the county show, really. Except the cattle are bigger. So, what happens next then? Now that the site has been put back to bed, what's going to be taking up your time, or our time?
Retire. Have a summer holiday. Well, I think I've touched on it many, many times that this is just the start of the next major phase. And although post-excavation has been ongoing for the last 20 years, really, it's just now entering this phase of concerted post-excavation. There's so much material to bring together, and it's going to take several years. But it's also continuing to hopefully tell the story of the Ness and share what we're doing on a regular basis. And make people understand that it's not just the excavation, there's that next stage, which is just as vitally important.
No, absolutely. I mean, getting all the detail from all the different kinds of analysis that are being done on the zooarchaeology, on the DNA of the animals, isotopes, a lot of work on the history of the floors, is just going to add all those little details to the biography of the buildings and how the place develops over time. It's really exciting, really exciting.
Well, also, field work hasn't technically finished, in that in 2 weeks' time, some of you might have seen advertised, we're conducting more geophysics as part of our Heritage Lottery Fund outreach project. So we're going to be conducting new surveys using resistivity and magnetometry. So with the resistivity in particular, we're actually praying for some rain because it makes the signal much stronger. But also, fingers crossed, we might be getting some more geophysics done later on in the month, but we'll wait and see what happens there.
I think it's interesting. Over 20 years, you can't help but find that your horizons drop to the scale of the trenches. And you think about the site, and you think about Trench B, Trench J, whatever it might be. And I think that's one of the things about filling it in that's been really good is I've had to raise my head, and the geophysics will be really good for that, of recognising that 20 years of your life, and it's still 9% of the site that's been excavated, 10%, something like that. So getting the survey to bring us back up to think about just how much is there in total. I think
Well, I think, as you say, it was when it was backfilled, the removal of the spoil heaps, which have somehow contained each trench, to see those removed, and suddenly you see the expanse of the whole of the Ness,
Yeah.
from the brig right the way back to beyond Brodgar Farm. It's suddenly this massive site.
I know, and there's this
It's
lovely
exciting.
connection again with the water on either side of the sky, and you just realise, once again, it's easier now in a way to see how the landscape itself lends itself and makes it special. Yeah, plenty to do.
The interviews work.
Yeah, it'll be lots of fun. I think we'll call it there. So, Nick, that's been great fun. Thank you.
Thank you.